Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Circle of Fellows. I'm Shel Holtz. I'm Shel Holtz. I am Director of Internal Communications for WebCore, which is a commercial builder in California. I am also an IABC Fellow, and I am joined by 4 IABC Fellows for what promises to be an interesting conversation about the relationship between communications, presumably mostly internal communications, and human resources. So we're going to jump into this conversation in just a minute. First, I want to let those of you who are watching in real time know that in YouTube, you can just use the chat function to ask a question or share an observation, and we will be sure to cover that over the course of this hour. And now I'd like to have the members of the panel introduce themselves, and we're going to go clockwise based on how I see you on the screen, and that means we would start with Rajeev, who appears to...
I'm Rajeev here from Mumbai in India, and I've been an IABC member for over 2 decades. And I have military experience, and I switched careers as the colonel in the army and came into the communication field. I did my PhD in communication at Texas A&M and department. Currently, I teach communication in management institutes, and I'm a study communication consultant here, and also focusing on writing a book on social responsibility.
Excellent. Good to have you here, Rajeev. Stacy, you're up next.
I'm Stacy Wilson. I am the owner of Elocore Consulting. I've been involved in IBC for a very long time. In my work, I focus specifically on internal communication, particularly projects that involve technology. So a lot of internet strategy, governance, content. And I live in Colorado.
Great. Neil, it's your turn.
Hi, everybody. Neil Griffiths. I'm based in the UK. My current role is Global Head of Diversity, Equality and Inclusion at ERM, which is the world's largest sustainability consultancy. And prior to that, I spent the best part of 15 odd years in various communication roles, mostly in internal communication and reporting into HR, interestingly. And I've been involved in IBC for a long time, but perhaps not as long as my panel members here.
Great. And Neil, I love your clock.
Thanks. It's a scene stealer.
Letty.
Hi, how are you? I'm Leticia Narvaez. I'm based in Mexico City. I'm very enthusiastic about being here. I've been working on communication for almost 30 years, and I have my own consulting firm with the main objective of building bridges for effective communication and engagement with employees and external stakeholders through mainly communication strategies and crisis management, measurement, social responsibility programs.
Great. Thanks, Letty. Truly international panel today, which accounts for the earlier start than usual to accommodate the varying time zones we have here. And let's get started with a question that I think a lot of people moving into internal communications find themselves wondering, and that is, why is it even necessary to talk about this relationship between HR and communications? Is there a point of friction between the two? And I'd like to share my experience with this very briefly, which is that in terms of which department you are part of, whether internal communications is part of HR or corporate communications, really isn't relevant. If you are with a department that understands what you do and supports it, you're going to be fine. But if you are with an HR department that sees the role of communications as strictly supporting HR, then you can end up not doing the kind of strategic communication that helps an organization move the needle and achieve its goals. And the same with an internal comms department that reports to corporate communications. If they just see your role as regurgitating the press releases that they're cranking out and reinforcing the external messages, again, you're not going to be able to lead an internal communication function that accomplishes much. So where do you start to look at building the appropriate relationship with HR, whether you're reporting to them or not? Well, this has been a great episode of Circle of Fellows.
I'll jump in, Shel. So I have kind of the quintessential example of what I think makes this relationship difficult sometimes. So I used to manage the communication practices in the Denver office for both Mercer and then later Towers Perrin, two large international HR consultancies. And at the time that I was hired into Mercer, they were looking to hire senior level communicators out of corporate to turn the communications practice into a more strategic practice, one that would be a lead practice and go out and find its own work. Prior to this time, the communications practice had strictly supported the other practices like benefits and retirement. And after a couple of years, all of these firms realized that the retirement and benefit practices were not really going to support that in the communications practice. They just wanted them to focus on the HR needs of the clients, and strategic communication in a broader sense was really not something that their clients in HR were going to support. And that was why all of those firms really ratcheted back. And a lot of us who had been hired out of corporate were laid off over a period of time. And you can look at every firm, all of the firms did the same thing. And it really has to do with this mentality in HR more broadly, that they don't understand the broader opportunity for communication. At the same time, though, HR has a tremendous opportunity, I would say, to leverage communication because they have so much benefit to gain in the organization. They have a lot of just a lot to gain from in terms of value and productivity and retention and you know, all of those things that HR is trying to accomplish. They just in many cases don't understand how communication can play in that. So I think that behavior in the larger HR firms is really demonstrative of a larger problem in the HR community. So that I would just share that as a little kind of example.
Yes, and that being said, I believe that's why it's fundamental that, according to my experience, that human resources and communication work very, very closely together. And because both of us, human resources and communication, we are all focused in influencing, in affecting behaviors, attitudes, actions of our employees towards the top purpose, the higher purpose of the company. And sometimes HR is more focused on what they have to do on benefits and salaries and other things. So if we work together as a committee and educating each other on what communication can do in order to help human resources, in order to achieve their purpose, then if we both understand each other and we work very, very hand in hand together, then we can achieve the results that we need with all employees and other stakeholders.
Neil, I want to throw this one to you because of the kind of work that you do. But most HR departments, if there's a DEI initiative in the organization, It's housed in the HR department, at least to some extent. It seems to me that that's part of a general shift or a general trend for HR to be a less transactional and a more strategic function, more of a partner to the organization. So, working in DEI, do you find that with other organizations that HR is now accountable for more of these types of activities in the organization rather than just enrolling in benefits and running compensation surveys and the like?
I think so. I think you're absolutely right, Shel. And as many organizations engage in without going to cliches, the war for talent, I think the role of a people function is that much more important, right? So it's less about, as you described, the transactional process related work that is associated with HR, and it becomes more of a, how are we building an employee experience? How are we building culture? And I think that's, going back to your original question around why is there that friction? I think there's friction because there's overlap, right? There's overlap between the work that's going on that is owned, if you will, by the HR space and that of communication. So, there's always that question of who owns employee engagement. You could argue that one of the main outcomes of communication work is employee engagement, but I know that there are probably many human resources functions that feel that they're the proprietors of employee engagement. So I think that's probably why we feel that friction, because there is the overlap of the two spaces.
Yeah, I saw a survey a couple of years ago that asked 100 HR people, 100 frontline employees, and 100 executives who owns culture in the organization, and each group overwhelmingly said, "We do." And the perception of what culture was and what the primary drivers of culture was varied among those groups. In working with human resources, how can communications sort of be the glue that binds all of these things, that ensures that there is consistency, that sort of avoids these silos, whether it's ownership of or perceived ownership of engagement, of culture, of experience?
Yeah, I think that there is friction also. There is also friction because there is a lack of understanding that the goal is common, that both the HR desired employee behaviors. And I would equate, communication role as, it's the blood that flows through the nervous system, while HR maintains the nervous system and provides it is communication blood that is flowing through the system and keeping the body functioning. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when we talk of HR, you're not merely talking of the department as such. Human resources management is not the responsibility of the department alone. It is the business leaders, the chain of command, the line managers, the immediate superior and peers who constitute the nervous system. So primarily the responsibility lies along this chain, and the body can only function when the nervous system and blood, which means the HR as well as the communication people, work together in a synchronous way. That is the kind of interdependency between the HR systems and communication systems in an organization.
Other thoughts at all?
Yeah, just to kind of reinforce what Rajeev is saying, I think that the communications team has a unique position in an organization to see broadly all of the different strategic efforts and intentions across the organization. HR, in the meantime, while they certainly work across the organization, I think they're more focused on their own strategic needs and don't necessarily take the the opportunity to really more deeply understand the strategic needs of the other parts of the business. But communications is already doing that. They really have to in order to support everyone across the organization. So there's a great opportunity there in partnership for communications to bring that value and understanding, broader understanding of the strategic initiatives across the whole of the organization to HR, which HR I find in a lot of cases overlooks. I mean, like you said, Shel, it all depends on the leadership in HR. If it's someone who's very strategic and sees these broader issues, that's awesome, and that's really beneficial to the organization. But otherwise, I think that HR has a lot of value to gain by partnering with communication because communication has that sort of unique bird's eye view.
Besides that, I believe that in something that communication can really help is that we are the experts in developing the narrative, the storytelling, those stories that are aligned with what needs to be communicated, that can create that link and that empathy with the employees. So that's a way in which communication can really help and work together hand in hand with human resources to communicate what needs to be communicated and to create that empathy and that alignment with the stakeholders. And besides that, also I believe that training leaders in becoming better communicators is also a job and a function in which communication can work very closely together with human resources in order to for them to be aware that not only the communication area is the responsible for communicating, but we can facilitate and can help the leaders of all the company to better communicate what needs to be communicated for all employees.
In the company where I work, the engagement initiatives, in fact, we have an employee experience initiative that's one of the 4 milestone elements of the long-term strategic plan. So it's certainly been elevated in the view of the leaders and the view of the employees. And it's HR that is kind of responsible for that. In fact, the head of HR in this company is the champion for employee experience on the strategic plan group. So when you look at things like experience, employee experience, and employee engagement, should these be primary areas of focus for communicators?
I would say yes. I mean, obviously, it depends on the scale of the organization. I think we're having these conversations in the context of perhaps medium to large organizations. But I think as people, talent, capability, priorities become elevated in the way that you describe, Shel, because I've seen it in other large organizations as well. As a strategic enabler, then communication needs to absolutely be across that, because these are all things that have been identified as factors that are going to make an organization successful. And we know from our own experience as communication professionals that that's where we have to connect ourselves, right? We have to be connected to the priorities that are advancing the organization in a material way. So I think absolutely, Shel, yes.
Don't we run the risk if we are thoroughly wrapped up in things like employee engagement of talking the talk, whereas the people who the front line looks to may not be walking the walk? Doesn't that create more problems than it solves if we're out there talking about things the way they aren't in the organization?
Yeah, definitely, Shel. That's the problem. Does happen where if communication says that people are greater asset, but the human resources actions are as if they are dispensable, then there's going to be great dissonance. And that's why before we answer the question of who should do it, we should also look at the structure that is desirable, to function in a collaborative way. you got to have the internal communication team somehow associated with the HR department. So one option is to have a dotted line relationship with the chief of head of HR of the corporate communication team. The other option is that to have a dotted line relationship with the head of corporate communication and then report directly to the head of HR. So these are different options which can be chosen based on the politics as well as the personal dynamics in organizations, and the roles got to be collaboration, and they have to work in very close conjunction to engagement. It cannot be said that employee engagement can be achieved by mere employee communication. Employee communication will not achieve engagement. There has to be a certain level of involvement of the employees, and that means having a range of processes which are designed to engage, support, understand, and elicit an optimum contribution level. That's the kind of involvement that is required.
I'll come in on that as well, Shel, if I can. And this is something that I'm always quite clear about when working on any project, but also with HR projects, is what does success look like for the communication around this versus and trying to disassociate that from what is the success of the project overall. Because we have run into problems in the past as communication departments where we're on the hook for failure when ultimately it was actually a failure of the nature that Rajeev just describes. So it's a really important question to ask when you're partnering with any function, but I would say in particular with HR, to say what is it that the communication is really responsible for here versus, flaws in your, I don't know, performance management system or whatever else it is that you're partnering with them on. So it's a really important question to ask.
Yes, and also, Shel, I think that you touch a very fundamental point, that is there's a big need to be consistent, coherence, consistency, to really walk the walk and really that the actions are aligned with what is being said. And you can only do this if you work very, very closely with human resources as communication function, with what I just mentioned about training leaders. So there is the same message that is aligned and connected with the policies and with what needs to be communicated. So consistency, coherence, it's fundamental for the work that has to be done between human resources and the communication function.
And Shel, if I could add to that, I think that consistency is also really important in how we proactively work with HR. We can't, as communicators, expect HR to always engage us if we're not engaging them as well when they need to be engaged. And I have an example recently with a client where they certainly expect HR to come to communications for certain collaborative efforts, but then in their work around the intranet, they have not really engaged HR the same way that they would like HR to engage them. And so that consistency, I think, is really important because that develops that relationship. So on both sides, they're going to include each other more consistently going forward.
As long as you brought up the intranet, Stacy, let's stick with that for a little bit. HR in most organizations has an HR site on the intranet. It serves as the portal maybe to benefits enrollment, self-service, all the other dimensions of self-service that we've seen emerge in the organization, including things as simple as that's where you get your pay stub. It doesn't get sent to you. You want to see it, you go into the portal and get it. How much should communicators be working with HR on their intranet presence? And should that intranet presence given the organization's responsibility for things like DEI and engagement and the like, should that involvement from HR be broader than it already is?
If you don't mind my jumping in on that, yes, I'm super passionate about this topic. Absolutely, HR has so much ROI to gain from the internet, perhaps more than any other department in an organization. So they definitely need to be engaged in a way that really helps them to fully leverage all the capability to serve their needs specifically, particularly transactional needs, because we know that completion of task on the internet drives usage, not just content. So if we can work with HR to automate their processes on the internet, that helps to drive usage across the board, which is a great benefit for everyone. But in addition, I think that you mentioned that HR has a place or a site or a space on the internet, and the really interesting thing that we see in research is that the users, the employees, don't really think about just the HR stuff as one bucket of stuff. They tend to think about all of their employment information as one bucket, and what that really calls for is a more collaborative approach to delivering all of that information to the employee, from HR, from finance, from all the different departments that provide all that information and all those transactions for employment overall. So it could be expense reimbursement, it could be travel arrangements, along with benefits and compensation and those things. But the employees bunch it all together in one big bucket. So, and they don't know, if you put the HR tag on it, they don't really understand what HR does. So they don't know what all is in that bucket if you call it HR. So that's something that we need to work with HR on, so that the intranet, both in terms of navigation and organization of all of that content and transactions, makes more sense to the employee.
Yeah, HR is also responsible in a lot of organizations for things like wellness, and that can include mental health. And I don't think the first thing people wonder when they go to the internet looking for those resources is which department owns it.
Exactly.
Right? It's got to be a more intuitive approach to the navigation, so that people can find what they're looking for based on the way they think about it, rather than which department is responsible for it.
Yes, and now that you mentioned, Shel, wellness, I believe that with the pandemic and now post-pandemic, this was a situation in which HR and communication had to work very, very closely together, because that was one of the main objectives and one of the main objectives that we need to satisfy, coming from what was going on with all the employees, with many of them working from home. And so the leaders had to show a real and authentic interest on the wellness of the employees, of their teams. So this is something in which human resources and communications had to be very, very, very close in order to train leaders and to make resiliency as a leadership work towards all the teams and the company.
As long as you raise the post-pandemic era that with luck we will continue to be entering, HR is tasked with some pretty controversial aspects of the post-pandemic world, as we look to a sort of a hybrid approach to work that a lot of organizations are going to implement. If you ask 10 leaders what the hybrid approach means, I think you would get 12 different definitions. And these are choppy waters to navigate. How can communications help the HR department, and by extension, the leadership of the organization, return employees to the workplace in a new model when we're not quite sure how that's going to shake out just yet?
Well, listening is the thing that pops up as you ask that question, Shel, right? So I think we need to be listening, and hopefully organizations have been listening throughout. So, you know, it won't be a new process for communication teams to be just embarking on, because I think flexibility is key here. So the organization is going to need to be very responsive to the very different needs of individuals. We you know, there's going to be implications in terms of comfort levels of using transport. There's going to be implications of people who have realized that their lifestyle has changed completely and they don't want to go back to the way that it was before. On the other end of that scale, you're going to have people who can't wait to get back to the way that it was before. So this notion of flexibility in this, and really listening to the stakeholders and where people are at, I think is one of the major contributions that the communication function can make in this next phase.
Yeah, I agree. And in terms of listening, I think that goes to engagement as well, since one of the key drivers of engagement is an employee voice, and internal communications facilitating that multi-directional communication can give some weight to that voice.
Yes, and that's a way in which communication can talk to human resources, making them aware of the importance of listening to employees before just announcing the new policies post-pandemic. But we need to listen and then work with human resources in order to establish the new ways of working, the new policies, so in order to be communicated. So this is a moment in which both areas have to work very, very closely together.
And sorry, go ahead, Rajeev.
Okay. I was saying that definitely there are certain negative psychological and behavioral consequences that can be seen. There would be emotional, psychological states of anxiety, of increased work stress. There would be a feeling of job insecurity also, and lack of job satisfaction. And one of the goals that we as communicators tend to forget is to improve employee morale. So, and morale gets neglected. While we may look at engagement, we may look at involvement, but how do you keep the morale high of the person? How you keep him motivated to keep working, to identify with the organization, to continue wanting to belong to that organization, and to contribute much more than required. That kind of behavioral response and increase in happiness in working, that tradition goals, especially during these times. And when
Rajeev looked like he froze up for a while there, but anybody care to jump in on that? Okay, I do want to remind the audience watching us in real time that we are happy to take your questions or share your observations. Just use the chat function in YouTube, and we'll be able to toss your question or your comment up on the screen and discuss it. A lot of what we have been talking about here requires a foundation of trust. And I'm wondering, you know, since HR is the function that interacts directly with all employees, and not many parts of the organization beyond HR actually do that, IT perhaps, but how can communicators work with HR, whether you're reporting to that function or elsewhere, to build trust in the organization?
I believe there are many drivers that we need to be aware of for building organizational trust, like competence, that is like capabilities, leadership, efficiency, achievement of objectives. Another one would be openness, transparency, and that's something in which we would need to work together with human resources. Concern for employees, listening, as we already mentioned, acting on employees' ideas, concerns, needs, leadership communication. Another one would be reliability, and then identification. So really the employees can identify with a higher purpose, mission, and values of the company. And in order to achieve this, we would need to work human resources and with all the leaders of the company in order to be aligned on what we already mentioned, and to be consistent to what is being done and what is being said in order to really gain the trust of the employees towards the company.
Yeah, I think that look at the kind of through which employees receive information. One is the official organizational channels. Then they see organizational what actions is the organization taking, and the third place that they get information is through rumors and grapevine. And looking at this, how do you increase trust is an interesting question. Trust comes when there's a purpose of justice. If as an employee I feel that whatever policies, whatever actions the HR does or the company does, I can perceive them that they do it out of a sense of equity and fairness. Decisions are made with equity and fairness, then I would be happy. I would also be happy if my perceptions about the fairness of the process, for example, promotion process is very transparent. And if I know that it is a very fair process, it increases my trust in the organization. The third thing which also improves trust is the interaction with my superiors. How do my superiors interact with me? Are they fair in treating me? If they are not fair, I will not trust them. So all these elements combine to accumulate and to increase health in the organization.
Yeah, I've heard trust defined as the expectation that the other party is going to do the right thing. Stacy?
If I can add to that, Shel, one of the challenges about building trust in a virtual environment is we don't have the same kinds of interactions that we have in person. And so I think that we're even more challenged now and likely going forward, because a lot of our employees probably will not go back to an office on a regular basis. So they'll remain working virtually. I think that makes that building of trust even more challenging. So we need to understand more about how to do that in a virtual setting, and help HR understand how that needs to work as well. And a lot of that comes back to something Rajeev mentioned, and that is around supervisors, managers, how those folks are managing in that virtual setting will have a lot to do with the extent to which we can continue to build trust.
Yeah, it seems that in that virtual setting, there needs to be some training on how to best maintain culture and productivity in a team that is either all or partly remote, and learning and development generally resides in the HR department. Where do we have a role to play as communicators on that particular issue?
I believe we have a fundamental role, and in all these years that I work mainly in charge of corporate communications or reporting to communications, but working very closely with human resources. That was something that I had to work very much with them, because human resources owns the function of training, but in the other hand, sometimes they don't think about the importance of training the leaders on how to better communicate. So we only train the supervisors and the managers that they have to communicate something to their teams, but we don't teach them how to do it and what kind of messages that are needed to be communicated. So I believe that's fundamental, especially now, as was mentioned in this virtual environment. What I have seen is that the leaders were not trained to communicate. So some of them do it very well, and they work with their teams. They work on an individual base, one-on-one, communicating with their team members. But some of them just did it as they felt they had to do it. So this is quite important now that that leaders have to be trained, and this is something in which communication needs to be very much involved in order to develop the content of this training in mainly how to communicate more effectively in different kind of environments.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Shel, I think that we are the subject matter experts. So we have that expertise to bring. And if we're not already embroiled in understanding managing in a virtual situation, we should be very deeply knowledgeable about that, so that we can help the training team to understand and teach the skill set required for virtual communication and virtual leadership. And this is interesting because it's something that IABC has been involved in for a long, long time. There was a research project conducted probably 2 decades ago, and I'm not even sure that they still have this document in print, but it was kind of a document search and review of research on virtual leadership and what skills were required in a virtual situation for managers to be successful, both in communication and their management practices. So IABC has a long history of being involved in this, and it's something that we need to take on as well, so that, like Letty said, we can provide that subject matter expertise to the training team and get all of that content right.
Yeah, I think it's also important as communicators that we're reinforcing the lessons in this training by shining a light on people who have adopted the practices that the training promotes and succeeded with it. Right. I think nothing sells that like recognition. Oh, doing this is what you get recognized around here for. We do have a question from the audience. Chip Griffin asks, are town halls an effective way to build trust with employees?
I think they can be if they're done the right way. If it's tokenistic and it's being done for the sake of doing it, then perhaps not. And I think there's a huge opportunity to reach a much greater audience through the virtual setup of these types of moments for an organization. But if it's broadcast only, in my view, I think that is not really meeting the expectations that people have now. I mean, if I think about a year ago, this huge sort of jump to Zoom or Teams or whatever, where we're having these virtual meetings, we were very uncomfortable with the fact that the chat function was going crazy whilst the meeting was going on, because we were presenting, right? So how dare you put me off? Now it's very normal for there to be a whole kind of side conversation going on whilst there's a presentation. So, and I think those types of leveraging the various ways of gathering interaction and being interactive in those sessions, I think is going to make them that much more successful. But it has to be done the right way, I think, and with the needs of the audience in mind.
Yes, and they also have to be very well prepared with alignment and create that alignment and connection and coherence between what the message is how the message is communicated, and with a session of questions and answers, and that what is being done really is aligned with what was before said in the town hall.
Yeah, I've long been an advocate for returning the town hall to its original intent, going back to colonial America, which is that in a corporate environment, the employees are either presenting or asking questions of leadership, not the other way around.
Right.
It's an opportunity for, at least in colonial America, it was an opportunity for the leaders of the town to hear the concerns of the residents. And I don't know how they got perverted into presentations to employees, but I would really like to see them flipped back around. We've been talking sort of coming at it sideways, the issue of managers and supervisors. It's long and often quoted that employees don't quit their companies, they quit their bosses. I've seen data that throws that into question, but in any case, managers and supervisors are key channels of communication. And probably the least reliable because you can't control it at all. Various managers have different approaches to communication. I saw data that said 79% of managers don't like communicating with their employees for a variety of different reasons. And yet training of managers and handling the performance management process is a human resources function. How do we influence that? How do we work with HR to make managers into better communicators?
So, Shel, when I do work with clients, I'll jump in real quick and then let Rajeev continue. So we focus on four things in this area. The first one is hiring for the skill set. So one of the things that we try to partner with HR on is to help them understand what kinds of questions to ask and skill sets to look for in the hiring process, so that you're bringing people into the organization or promoting them to that leadership role, in part because they have that communication skill set already. So that's number one. Number two is training, and we've talked a lot about training already, and that's absolutely crucial. And we definitely should be intimately involved in the establishment of that curriculum. The third one is tools. So providing tools on an ongoing basis for managers and leaders at all levels to help them be successful in communication. And the last one is measurement. We need to be able to measure their capability and provide them with feedback so that they can improve, because otherwise it doesn't establish communication as a critical skill set, one that the organization is really depending on, and it's important enough. If it's important enough to depend on, then it's important enough to measure. So I'll leave it at that and let Rajeev jump in.
All right. What I was going to add to what Stacy says is that the HR has to look at appraisal from a development point of view. They are responsible for human resources development. Then the appraisal process primarily identifies what are the areas for development for a person. And appraisal interviews are, of course, one of the skills that the communicator can help managers learn how to go about it. But what is more important is the mindset of the appraiser. Is the appraiser really a mentor? Is the appraiser really interested in developing the candidate? Because if the employee understands this, his perceptions about his superior are that this person is really trying to help me develop further and grow to be more productive and grow to be more efficient, then the acceptance of the appraisal becomes very, very smooth and constructive. So changing mindset is more important, and conveying the perception that you're really interested in their development. That should be the focus of any communication in that spot.
We have a comment from Chip that we can discuss. He says managers need to be better managers first. Communications is part of it, but many line managers don't really understand their roles. And Stacy, I think that gets to what you were talking about, that frequently people are hired into manager roles based on their technical skills that they demonstrated when they had nobody reporting to them. And they aren't really prepared for the dimensions of the job that are strictly focused on managing the people who report to you. I know when I was at Mattel in the mid-'80s, they had a program called the Mattel Management Excellence Program that anybody being hired or promoted into a manager program had to go through. I think it was 17 half days on Fridays, and they referred to this as the Mattel MBA. This was the way that you learned how to be a manager the Mattel way, but everybody got the same training, so there was a level of consistency around this, and it dealt with everything from communication to conflict resolution, for example.
I think you're right, Shel, that it really is incumbent on us to collaborate with HR in all of those 4 stages that I mentioned earlier. And certainly to Chip's point, part of that is helping managers understand their role. But this issue of promoting people because they're a great technician to a leadership role is a huge challenge that we see frequently, particularly in heavy industry. So just because you're great in managing a line in the plant does not necessarily make you the right person to move on. But a lot of organizations don't have a dual track where you can move up in management or move up in the technical side. So that's a challenge to find opportunities for people to move up and move forward, gain responsibilities and obviously compensation. So we need to definitely work with HR to help understand some of those challenges and communicate those clearly to all of the employees so that they understand what their track is and how they get there and what kinds of things that they need to learn and do in order to move up.
Shel, I was going to pick up on another data point that I sort of know to be true from experience over the years, and that is that people prefer to hear from their manager on things. So yes, they appreciate the organizational communication, but actually when it comes to the crunch, they actually want and trust more the communication that comes from managers. And I think that as a function, we can be very helpful to HR and indeed to the broader organization if we really push that point and stress that actually, communication skill amongst managers is essential if we really want to drive the messages home that the organization cares about. So for me, that's a really important way of making the contribution that you asked us about.
Yes, definitely. Just touching on what Neil said, I would like to reinforce that people really wants to hear from their direct supervisor or manager. So that's why our function is quite important, and complementing what Stacy mentioned as one of the elements of training in the area of tools. I believe what we need to give a very precise guideline and content and ways of communicating to the supervisors, because sometimes it can be assumed if we only tell them you need to communicate this specific issue, some of them may decide to communicate it today, or some of them will communicate it in a week, some of them through an email, some of them in a meeting, sometimes one-on-one. So we can assume that they will communicate it, but each of them will choose the better way. They think it's more effective. So that's why we need to be very, very precise on the way in which we support them with training, with tools, with measurement.
I want to reinforce that as well. Being really clear what the expectations are is essential.
Yes.
And never assume that because you've said it's important that you communicate this, that has happened. And certainly if you don't provide the means with which somebody can do that, the chances of that actually ever being communicated are very, very slim.
As we move into this post-pandemic world, which will probably have a hybrid work model for a lot of employees, the employee experience is going to be primarily digital. I mean, if you're working from home, the experience you have with the organization is what's coming to you over digital devices. So how do HR practices, how does HR content, how does that influence an employee's experience in the organization, and what role can communicators play there?
Well, it needs to be very findable and accessible. That's number one. If people can't find what they're looking for about HR, if they can't quickly get to the questions, they tend to pick up the phone. But interestingly, the phone thing kind of is moving as the current newer generations tend to not want to talk to people on the phone. So they just want to be able to go out and get the information on their own or do whatever task they have to do with regard to HR. So we need, I think, first to really focus on findability and usability, so they can find what they need and they can really use what they find when they get there. So that I would say is kind of step number one, and I'll let the rest of the panel talk to additional steps after that.
Well, besides that, the supervisors and all the leaders in the company needs to know, they need to have the information. So human resources must communicate them and make them aware of what it's being communicated through the intranet or some other platform. In order for if the employee asks their leaders, maybe the leader would not know it's 100%, but that they are aware of what is being communicated and what is being said, and they can guide their team members.
And I'll pick up on the notion of values, Shel. It's not something that's really come up yet so far, but that's another space that HR tends to be very connected to. And for me, I think this is a huge opportunity for us to have conversations around purpose and around values and how that all builds the employee experience. Because I think, back to a lot of what we've said, actions and words working together, I think there's a huge opportunity to connect back to purpose and values as we consider how to create culture with people who aren't going to be experiencing that in person for a large part of their time at the company.
Yeah, I think one other role that we can play is identifying newer ways of engaging with employees, newer ways of presenting these processes that better accommodate a remote workforce. I think we get so comfortable with the processes that we already have set up that we don't think about how it can be done better. And I think a lot of that can emerge from, as was discussed earlier, listening to employees. We talked about that in a different context, but to listen to employees about what's working and what's not working so well in this remote environment can help guide those discussions.
And I would say also, let's not agonize over the change process around those things, right? Because if anything that last year showed us is that we do not need to obsess about change management, because we can actually make an entire workforce remote overnight. So if we can do that, then let's not painstakingly agonize over change processes.
And that will take us right to the top of the hour. So I want to thank the panel. This has been an enlightening conversation. I also want to let you know what's coming up next month. Circle of Fellows episode number 70. Can't believe we're up to 70 already. Will be on Thursday, June 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That is a complete 12-hour shift from where we started today, and that's to accommodate Adrian Cropley, who will be joining us from Australia. Also, John Clemens, Jim Lukaszewski, Jennifer Waugh, and with luck, Ritzy Ronquillo in the Philippines will be able to participate in this conversation about personal and professional success best measures. So that'll be coming up again. This is on Thursday, June 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks again, everybody. It's been great, and we'll see you all next month.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Shel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.